The heartbreaking case of Julie and Gonzalez. Julie and Gonzalez sat by the window, her hands trembling as she gazed out into the darkened streets. The wind howled, rattling the glass, but it was the silence inside the room that unsettled her most. Her heart beat loudly in her chest, matching the rhythm of the storm outside. She could smell the dampness of the rain, the scent of wet earth mixing with the sterile air of the room. The flickering light from a broken lamp cast long shadows on the walls. She reached for her phone, but her fingers fumbled, her mind too clouded to think clearly. Julie's eyes kept darting to the door, her skin prickling with an unknown fear. What was that sound? A soft shuffle from the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. She rose from her chair, her legs weak beneath her. Slowly, she crept towards the door. Her hand hovered over the knob. The air felt heavier now, thick with something wrong. Julie hesitated. Something was not right. She opened the door. Nothing. But as she turned to close it, she heard the voice. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Help me?" Julie froze. The voice was familiar, yet distant. Her heart pounded in her ears as she stepped back into the hallway, eyes scanning the shadows. Was she imagining it? Her mind raced, but she could feel the air grow colder around her. Then she saw it, a shadow, moving just beyond the corner of the hallway. Julie's breath caught in her throat. Her body screamed to run, but she stayed frozen. The figure emerged, pale, with hollow eyes, and a familiar face. Her mother. But it couldn't be. Her mother had been gone for years. Julie's eyes blurred with tears as she whispered, "Mom?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, eyes fixed on her with a chilling emptiness. Julie's chest tightened, the air feeling as if it were closing in around her. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. Everything went black. The last thing she heard was that whisper echoing in her mind. "Help me?" Julie awoke to the sound of her own gasping breath. Her eyes snapped open, but the world around her was blurry, spinning. The room was still, eerily quiet. She was back in her chair, but she couldn't remember how she got there. Her heart raced, thumping painfully in her chest. Was it real? Was it a dream? She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the disorienting feeling. But then, her gaze landed on something on the floor. A small, crumpled photo. It was her mother, young, smiling, vibrant. Julie's hand trembled as she reached down to pick it up. Something was wrong. The photo felt different, like it had been there for years, but she had never seen it before. Suddenly a noise. The floorboards creaked behind her. Julie's heart leapt to her throat. She didn't turn around. But then, the whisper came again, soft like the wind. "Julie, it's not over." Her entire body froze. The voice, no. The presence was unmistakable. Her mother was here again. Julie stood up, her knees shaking, her feet cold against the floor. She spun around, searching the room in a panic. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick, heavy with the sensation of being watched. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally. Julie felt a presence, something close, standing right behind her. She could hear the soft brush of footsteps on the floor. But when she turned, there was no one there. Her pulse hammered in her ears. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating her. Julie stumbled backward, tripping over something. She fell to the ground, her breath catching. And then she saw it. A hand, reaching out from under the floorboards. Julie's body froze in horror. It was as if time itself had stopped. The hand moved slowly, its fingers long and pale, dirt clinging to the skin. It was coming closer. Julie tried to scream, but her voice was lost, caught in her throat. The hand reached for her. Cold, clammy fingers brushed against her wrist. And then everything went dark again.
Julie's consciousness flickered like a dying flame. She fought to open her eyes, but the darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating her. When her eyes finally fluttered open, she wasn't in the room anymore. The air was thick with dust, and the ground beneath her felt rough, like old concrete. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the air smelled of decay. she was no longer in her home. Julie tried to move, but her body was heavy, as if it didn't belong to her. She looked around, her heart racing. The space was unfamiliar, cold, and abandoned. But there, in the corner of the room, she saw something, a figure, a silhouette, standing in the shadows, watching her. Julie's breath hitched. Her skin crawled. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It was her mother, just like before. But this time, she wasn't smiling. Her mother's face was twisted, hollowed out, like a mask that had lost its shape. The eyes, empty, black pits. Julie, the voice was no longer a whisper. It was a low, guttural growl. Julie's blood ran cold. Her heart slammed in her chest. "Why didn't you help me?" The voice echoed, reverberating through the walls. Julie wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Her body felt trapped in this nightmare. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching longer. "Help me, Julie." The voice was now all around her, suffocating her, drowning her. She couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in tighter, the walls pressing in like they were alive. Her hands reached out, desperate, but there was nothing to hold on to. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take any more, the darkness swallowed her whole. Julie felt herself falling into an endless void, a cold and oppressive blackness that seemed to stretch forever. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, the pounding deafening in the silence. She reached out, but her hands met nothing. Her body felt weightless, as if she were floating in space, lost in the nothingness. A faint sound reached her ears, distant, almost imperceptible. It was her name, Julie. The voice, soft and mournful, echoed from somewhere deep within the void. She turned, or at least tried to, her body moving like it was trapped in slow motion. There, in the distance, a faint light flickered, a tiny, fragile beacon in the endless dark. Julie pushed herself toward it, desperate for something, anything, to anchor her. The light grew brighter as she approached, but with it, the air became thicker, suffocating. And then she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the light. Her mother. But this time, she was different. Her face was no longer twisted with horror. Instead, it was calm, eerily so. Julie's breath caught in her throat. "Mom?" Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. Her mother's eyes locked with hers, empty, void-like, but filled with a strange, unsettling peace. "Julie." The voice was soft now, like a lullaby. Julie took a step forward, but before she could move any closer, her mother raised a hand. "Don't come any closer," she said, her voice breaking the silence like glass shattering. Julie stopped. Her heart raced as her mother's figure began to dissolve into the light, fading slowly. "Mom." Julie cried out, but the words were swallowed by the growing darkness. The light vanished completely, and Julie was plunged into absolute blackness once more. Panic rose in her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She screamed, but her voice was lost in the emptiness. And then, through the void, came that whisper again. "Help me." It wasn't her mother anymore. It was something else, something darker, something that had been waiting for her. Julie's eyes snapped open. She was back in a room. But it wasn't the same room. The walls were closing in on her, the shadows now twisting and writhing like living things. The air was heavy with dread, thick with a presence that made her skin crawl. Julie stood, trembling. She was no longer alone. The figure in the corner of the room was back, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. "Help me, Julie," the figure whispered again, the words cutting through the silence. And this time, Julie knew there was no escape.
Julie's body froze in terror as the figure stepped closer. Its movements were slow but deliberate, its presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. The air grew colder, the shadows creeping along the walls, reaching toward her. She tried to move, to run, but her feet wouldn't budge, as if the ground beneath her had turned to stone. The figure's hollow eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. It wasn't her mother anymore. It was something far worse. The face in front of her was pale, almost lifeless, its features contorted into a grotesque mockery of a human. Julie's breath came in shallow gasps as it spoke again, its voice a raspy whisper. "Why didn't you help me, Julie?" Each word felt like a blade piercing her heart. Her mind screamed for her to move, to escape, but her body refused to obey. The shadows around her seemed to close in tighter, suffocating her, swallowing every ounce of light. The temperature dropped, and her breath turned to fog, hanging in the air like a deathly mist. The figure was right in front of her now. Julie could feel the cold radiating from it, seeping into her skin, numbing her bones. She could hear its breathing, slow, uneven, almost mechanical. It reached out a hand toward her, its fingers long and bony, with nails that looked as though they had been sharpened into claws. Julie wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in her throat. She was trapped. The figure's hand hovered just inches from her face, and for a moment, she thought she saw something behind the mask of darkness. A face. Her mother's face, distorted and twisted by pain. Tears filled Julie's eyes, her heart breaking as the memories flooded back. She had failed her mother. She hadn't been there when it mattered most. The figure's lips twisted into a twisted smile, its breath cold against Julie's skin. And then, with a sudden movement, it touched her. A surge of icy pain shot through her body, spreading like fire through her veins. Julie screamed, but the sound was drowned out by a deafening roar, as if the entire world had come alive with a terrible force. The room spun around her, the walls contorting, warping as if they were being torn apart. And then, with a final, gut-wrenching crash, everything went black. Julie's mind spiraled into an abyss, caught between the realms of life and death, between reality and nightmare. And as the darkness swallowed her whole, she heard one final whisper, soft and haunting. "Help me!" And then, silence. The silence was deafening, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. Julie's mind hung in suspended animation, unable to comprehend what was real and what was a nightmare. Time lost all meaning. It felt as though she was floating, suspended in a world where nothing existed except for the darkness that surrounded her. But then a flicker. A faint light appeared on the horizon, a spark in the infinite blackness. Julie reached for it, drawn to it with an overwhelming sense of urgency. Her hand moved slowly, as if every motion was a struggle against the weight of the darkness pressing down on her. The light grew brighter, pulsating in rhythm with her heartbeat. And then she heard it, a voice. "Julie!" The voice was gentle now, tender, as though it was calling her home. Julie's heart skipped a beat. It was her mother's voice. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she reached for the light, her fingers brushing against it, and the warmth that radiated from it was like a lifeline pulling her back from the edge. The light consumed her, enveloping her in its embrace. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Julie felt safe. But as the light grew brighter, something shifted. The warmth faded, replaced by an unsettling cold that gnawed at her skin. The voice, once soothing, grew distorted. "Help me, Julie." The words were no longer filled with love. They were hollow, empty, just like the figure in the room. Julie's eyes shot open. She wasn't floating in the void anymore. She was back in the room, the cold air biting at her skin. The walls were still closing in, the shadows creeping toward her. The figure was gone, but the feeling remained. Something was still watching her. Julie's body trembled as she forced herself to stand, the room spinning around her. She tried to move, but her limbs were stiff, heavy, like they were made of stone. The voice echoed in her mind again, louder now, reverberating through her skull. "Help me!" Julie squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside her, tearing at her from the inside out. She staggered toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest, every step feeling like it might be her last. When she reached the door, she yanked it open. But there, standing in the hallway, was the figure. And this time, it wasn't just watching her. It was waiting. Julie's breath hitched in her throat as the figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes never leaving hers. The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the hallway, the walls closing in as if the house itself were alive, moving to suffocate her. The temperature dropped even further, her breath coming out in visible puffs of frozen air. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, but her body was paralyzed, locked in place by a terror so deep it felt like it was sinking into her bones. The figure moved closer, its steps slow, deliberate. Julie's pulse thundered in her ears, the sound deafening in the silence. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and flee, but she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, trapped in this nightmarish dance. "Help me!" The voice again, but now it wasn't just her mother's voice. It was a chorus, many voices, all calling to her, all pleading for her to do something. But what? What could she do? The figure was standing directly in front of her now, its face inches from hers. Julie could feel its cold breath on her skin, like a frost settling into her very soul. "Why didn't you save me?" it whispered, and the words felt like a blade cutting through her chest. She gasped, her hands trembling, wanting to push the figure away, but unable to move. And then, without warning, the figure's face began to change, morphing into something unrecognizable. The hollow eyes became deep pools of darkness, swallowing everything around them. Julie's vision blurred, the world spinning, the room stretching and contracting like it was alive, alive with the torment that now filled the air. The voices grew louder, more desperate. They surrounded her, suffocating her with their cries. "Help me! You have to help me!" Julie's chest tightened, her breath shallow, her heart a drumbeat in her ears. And then everything stopped. The voices, the figure, the darkness. It all vanished in an instant, leaving Julie alone, standing in the hallway. But the silence was different now. Heavy, unnatural. Julie didn't dare move. She just stood there, staring into the emptiness, waiting for something, anything. And then a soft sound, the faintest whisper. "Julie!" Her mother's voice. But it wasn't comforting anymore. It was cold, distant, lost. Julie turned, but there was nothing. No figure. No presence. Just the empty, silent hallway. The room felt empty, like a memory fading away. But Julie couldn't shake the feeling. She wasn't alone. And she never would be again. That Julie's skin prickled with a creeping unease. The sense that something was still there, lurking just beyond the edges of her vision. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to take a step forward. The hallway stretched out before her, dark and silent, like a never-ending void. She glanced behind her. No figure, no shadow, but she could still hear it, the faintest rustle, like footsteps on the floor. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow. She turned back around, her gaze darting to every corner, every shadow. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Julie's footsteps echoed in the silence as she walked, each one louder than the last, a rhythmic pounding that matched her erratic heartbeat. And then, just as she reached the end of the hallway, she saw it. A door. It hadn't been there before. It stood at the far end, cracked open, a thin sliver of light spilling out from within. Julie's body froze. She didn't want to go any closer. But something, the same force that had pulled her toward the figure, drove her forward. The door creaked as she reached for the handle, the sound scraping against her eardrums like nails on a chalkboard. Her hand hovered over it, her breath caught in her throat. Something was waiting for her inside. But she had to know. Julie turned the knob, her hand trembling. The door opened with a groan. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air felt thick, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. At first, there was nothing, just empty space. But then, a low whisper, barely audible, rose from the shadows. "Julie!" It was her mother's voice again. This time, it was desperate. It was calling her, begging her to step inside. Julie's heart hammered in her chest as she hesitated. The whispers grew louder, closer. "Please, Julie. It's not over." Her body moved against her will. She took a step forward, then another, her feet dragging across the cold floor. The room seemed to expand as she moved deeper into it, the shadows stretching out like dark fingers reaching for her. And then she saw it. A mirror. The same mirror that had been in her mother's bedroom. Julie's breath caught in her throat as she walked toward it, drawn by the reflection she knew she would see. As she stood before the glass, her heart stopped. It wasn't her face that stared back at her. It was her mother's. Her mother's hollow eyes, her twisted expression, right there, staring back at her from the other side. Julie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The reflection of her mother raised a hand, reaching out toward her. Julie recoiled, but it was too late. The mirror began to crack, slowly at first, and then with a deafening crash, the glass shattered. And in that instant, the darkness swallowed her whole. Julie's eyes widened in horror as the door loomed before her once more, impossibly appearing where it hadn't been moments ago. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the walls were closing in around her, urging her to return. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to move, to keep putting one foot in front of the other, though every instinct screamed at her to run. But where could she go? The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. The door in front of her now, the only thing that seemed tangible, real. It beckoned her, a magnetic pull drawing her toward it. Julie's heartbeat echoed in her ears as she stood frozen in place, staring at the door that felt like both a prison and a way out. The voices became clearer. "Come back, Julie. It's waiting." A chill ran down her spine as she took a step closer to the door. The faintest squeak of the hinges reached her ears, the sound slicing through the silence like a knife. It was the same door, the same handle, the same faded wood that had once trapped her inside. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling, and for a moment she hesitated. But then the voices became deafening, impossibly loud. "Open it, Julie. It's time." Her hand gripped the handle, and with a sudden burst of adrenaline, she twisted it. The door swung open with a violent force, and the room beyond was familiar. It was the same room she had been in earlier, the same dim lighting, the same twisted shadows hanging in the corners. The air was thick with dread, but something was different this time. The air was heavier, and the figure stood there again. But this time, its eyes were wide open, staring directly at her. And it wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Julie's breath caught in her throat as she backed away, unable to tear her gaze from its haunting, hollow stare. No, she couldn't go back. She refused to. But the figure stepped forward, its shadow stretching impossibly long, stretching toward her like it was trying to engulf her. "Julie!" It whispered her name, each syllable dragging her deeper into the nightmare. She turned, her legs barely able to carry her as she stumbled away from the door. But when she looked behind her, the hallway was gone. There was only the room and the figure. The darkness seemed to swallow her whole. Her heart pounded in her chest as the walls seemed to close in, pressing against her from all sides. And then, the whispers, no longer just voices but screams, erupted, shaking her to the core. "Help me!" Julie's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor. The room spun around her, the darkness closing in like an unrelenting force. Her eyes darted around, desperate for an escape, but the figure had disappeared. In its place was a mirror, standing tall in the center of the room, reflecting her face. But it wasn't her. It was her mother. Julie's breath caught in her throat as the reflection began to move, its lips curling into a smile. "No, no." Her voice was barely a whisper as she backed away, but the mirror's gaze followed her every move. And then the reflection in the glass spoke, its voice not her mother's, but something much darker. "You cannot escape me, Julie." The darkness crept closer, enveloping her completely. And as the last of the light vanished from the room, Julie knew. She had never truly escaped. The world around Julie collapsed into an inky void, suffocating her with its oppressive weight. She could no longer feel her body, no longer hear her own frantic heartbeat. It was as though everything had been swallowed whole. The room, the very essence of her existence. The mirror's reflection grinned wider, its features twisted and distorted into something unrecognizable. Julie's throat tightened as she tried to scream, but no sound escaped. It wasn't just the darkness that closed in on her now. It was a presence, cold and ancient, a force that seemed to seep into her very soul. The whispers surrounded her, no longer just echoes but sharp, biting voices that clawed at her mind. "Help me, Julie. Come back to us." The words grew louder, more demanding, as if they were calling her from the depths of a forgotten place. Julie's heart lurched. She couldn't bear it any longer. With every ounce of willpower, she fought to regain control of her body, to break free from the suffocating grip of the darkness. But the more she struggled, the tighter it held her, the more impossible escape seemed. Her mind began to fracture, the whispers and the grinning reflection overwhelming her. And then, in the suffocating silence that followed the chaos, she heard something else, a voice that was clear, commanding. "Julie!" It wasn't her mother. It wasn't the figure. It was her own voice. A voice she hadn't heard in what felt like forever. For a moment, there was stillness. A fragile hope flickered, like a tiny flame in the pitch-black void. "Julie, you have to wake up. This is not real. You have to fight." Julie's mind struggled to make sense of the words, the clarity they offered in the midst of her nightmare. But then the presence grew stronger, pressing down on her chest like an invisible weight. The darkness responded, curling around her, suffocating her hope. "You cannot wake up," it hissed, the voice coming from every direction at once. "Not from this, not from us." The laughter returned, cold and hollow, echoing through her bones. Julie's vision blurred, and she felt herself slipping. But then, she remembered. The light, the door, the choice. She had to choose. It was all she could do now. Julie summoned every ounce of strength she had left, focusing on the voice that had called to her, her own. "Wake up," she whispered through clenched teeth. "Wake up!" And with that final scream, everything shattered. The darkness cracked, splintering into countless pieces, disintegrating into nothing. Julie gasped for air, her body heaving as the world around her brightened. She was back in the hallway, the one that had felt endless, suffocating. But this time it was different. The walls were no longer closing in. The air was lighter. Her breath came easily. And there, standing in front of her, was the door. The same door. But it wasn't a trap. It was a way out. Julie stepped forward, her heart still racing, but filled with a newfound clarity. As her hand grasped the door handle, she paused. And for a fleeting moment, she turned back. The darkness had faded, the whispers gone. But she couldn't shake the feeling. Deep down, she knew it wasn't truly over. Not yet. Not until she left this place behind forever. With one final, resolute push, Julie opened the door and stepped into the light. Julie felt herself falling, the pieces of the shattered mirror flying around her like shards of glass. But it wasn't the ground that caught her. It was an overwhelming coldness, like being submerged in icy water. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. Her body felt numb, as if it had been pulled into the very fabric of the darkness itself. The air was thick, heavy with the oppressive weight of something ancient, something malevolent. Her heart pounded in her chest, echoing in the silent void. She tried to scream, but the sound was trapped inside her, suffocated by the emptiness. And then she heard it, a whisper, her mother's voice, faint and distant, yet filled with an unmistakable urgency. "Julie, it's not over." Not yet. Julie's breath caught in her throat. She struggled against the invisible force that held her in place, her mind racing, desperate to break free. But the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Help me, Julie. Please help me." The words were no longer gentle. They were demanding, pleading, as if they were coming from somewhere deep within her own soul. Julie could feel it now, a cold, creeping presence that was slowly consuming her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Her skin crawled with the sensation of invisible hands brushing against her, dragging her down. But then a light, faint, distant, but unmistakable, appeared through the darkness. A small, flickering flame, like a candle in the wind. Julie's body reacted before her mind could comprehend it. She reached for the light, her hands stretching out toward the warmth, the safety it promised. With every ounce of strength, she pushed herself toward it, determined to escape whatever nightmare had ensnared her. But as she drew closer, the light began to flicker and fade, like it was being swallowed by the shadows. "Julie!" The voice was louder now, more desperate, coming from every direction at once. It wasn't her mother anymore. It was something else, something worse. Julie's heart raced as the light blinked out entirely, plunging her back into complete darkness. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were all she could hear. "Help me! Help me, Julie!" The voice was suffocating, crushing her from all sides. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the darkness opened up, only to reveal something far worse than she could have ever imagined. A figure, standing in front of her. But this time, it wasn't her mother. It was something far more terrifying. The figure was a grotesque, twisted version of a person, its eyes black voids, its skin pale and stretched tight over its skeletal frame. It moved closer, its mouth stretching into a wide grin, sharp teeth glistening in the dim light. Julie's breath hitched as the figure reached for her, its fingers cold as ice. And then, in a voice that made her soul tremble, it whispered, "You can't escape." The figure's grip tightened around her wrist, and Julie's body froze, paralyzed by sheer terror. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, her mind racing, screaming for her to fight, to break free. But the more she struggled, the tighter its grip became, like a vice closing in on her. "You're mine now, Julie," the figure whispered, its voice cold and cruel. The shadows around them seemed to pulse, growing darker, deeper. Julie felt herself being dragged closer, her feet scraping against the cold floor, her heart racing wildly. The figure's hollow eyes locked onto hers, and she could feel its gaze seeping into her very soul, like it was searching for something, something she couldn't hide. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. Julie could feel its power. It was feeding off her fear, growing stronger with each passing second. "Please, let me go," she gasped, her chest tightening, her lungs begging for air. The figure's smile widened, its face contorting in a way that was both horrifying and unnatural. "You will never escape," it said, its voice dripping with malice. Julie's vision blurred, her body beginning to shut down under the pressure. And then, as if in response to her desperate cry, something shifted. A flash of light, barely a flicker at first, illuminated the darkness just enough to make her see something. A door she hadn't noticed before, standing at the far end of the room. Her pulse quickened as she focused on it, the only thing that seemed to offer any chance of escape. But the figure wasn't done. It pulled her closer, its icy fingers digging into her skin. "You'll never leave," it growled, dragging her toward it. Julie's heart raced in her chest, a wild beat of survival. In one final, desperate attempt, she tore herself away from its grip, stumbling toward the door. Each step felt like it took everything she had, the weight of the figure's presence still hanging over her. The air grew heavier as she neared the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Just a few more steps, and then, with a strength she didn't know she had, she slammed into the door, throwing it open with all her might. Light poured in, blinding her for a moment. She stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath, her heart pounding like it was about to explode. She turned to look behind her. Nothing. The room was empty. The figure was gone, but the darkness remained. The heavy, suffocating feeling lingered in the air, as though it were watching her, waiting for her to slip up. Julie took another step, then another, her legs weak beneath her, but she couldn't stop. She had to get out, had to escape. But as she made her way down the hallway, the voices started again. Whispers, her mother's voice, the figure's laugh, all of them coming from the walls themselves. "Help me!" Julie's breath caught in her throat as the world around her began to twist, the walls warping, the floor shifting beneath her feet. And in the distance she saw it again, the door she had just escaped from. It was waiting for her. As Julie stepped through the door, the blinding light enveloped her, wrapping around her like a protective cocoon. The warmth was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the cold that had plagued her for so long. For a moment, she just stood there, letting the light fill her, let it heal the wounds the darkness had left on her soul. But as the light softened and her eyes adjusted, she saw where it led. A familiar place. A place she hadn't seen in years. Her childhood home. The hallway was quiet, peaceful. Nothing like the twisted nightmare she had just escaped. The walls were bright, adorned with family photos and colorful paintings. Everything was in its place, just as she remembered it. She exhaled slowly, her body trembling from the relief. But something nagged at the back of her mind. The shadows. They were still there, faint, almost imperceptible, but they lingered in the corners of her vision. Julie's pulse quickened. She glanced over her shoulder toward the door she had just passed through. It was gone. The darkness was gone. But the sensation of it, the weight of it, still clung to her like a lingering aftertaste. Was she free? Or was this just another layer of the nightmare? As she moved forward, her footsteps echoing through the empty hall, she could feel the floor beneath her shifting, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting for her to make a choice. A choice she hadn't yet fully understood. Julie reached the living room, where everything was as it should be. Her mother's favorite chair sat by the window, bathed in soft light. The air smelled faintly of lavender, a comfort. But when she turned to look at the mantelpiece, something caught her eye. A photo. It was an old picture of her and her mother, laughing, standing together at the beach. Julie's heart clenched. But as she stepped closer to the mantel, the room around her seemed to ripple, like a mirage. The photo, it wasn't just a photo anymore. It was moving. The faces of her and her mother blurred, their smiles stretching into something grotesque. Julie stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she whispered, but it was too late. The edges of the photo curled, and the laughter, her mother's laughter, became distorted, twisting into something darker. "Julie," her mother's voice echoed through the room, no longer filled with love, but with a chilling, unnatural tone. Julie's body tensed, and she turned to flee, but the walls began to close in on her, just like before. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. And standing at the far end of the hallway, in the place where the door had been, the figure appeared once more. It was no longer just a shadow. It was her mother, or a twisted version of her. The hollow eyes stared at Julie, and the smile, that same sickening, mocking smile stretched across her face. Julie's pulse raced as the figure began to move toward her, slowly at first, but gaining speed. It wasn't her mother anymore. It was something else, something that was now wearing her mother's face. Julie backed away, her body frozen with fear. Her legs were heavy, the weight of the darkness pulling her back. And then, in the most terrifying moment yet, the figure spoke again, its voice splitting the air like thunder. "You can never escape me, Julie. You belong to me now." Julie's breath came in ragged gasps, her world spinning. She had to wake up. She had to break free. But this time, she wasn't sure if it was even possible. And as the figure advanced, Julie realized there was no escape. The figure's footsteps echoed louder with each passing second, filling the space around Julie, suffocating her with their finality. Her heart hammered in her chest, her mind screaming for her to run, but her legs refused to obey. The smile on the figure's face stretched impossibly wide, as though it knew her every fear, every weakness. Julie's gaze flickered to the door she had come through, but it was no longer there. The hallway stretched endlessly behind her, a black void that swallowed everything in its path. There was nowhere to go. The figure's eyes bore into her, dark and empty, like twin voids that were slowly consuming everything in sight. "Why do you keep running, Julie?" it asked, its voice dripping with cold amusement. "Don't you know you can never escape me?" Julie's breath hitched, and for the first time, she felt a terrifying clarity. The darkness had always been a part of her. It was in her, around her, and now it had come to claim her. No matter how far she ran, it would always be there, waiting to pull her back. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing thoughts. But when she opened them again, she was no longer in the hallway. She was standing in front of a mirror. The same mirror she had seen in the room with the figure. But this time, it reflected her face. Only it wasn't just hers. There, in the reflection, her mother stood beside her. Her mother's hollow eyes, just like the figures, staring back at her with a sinister, knowing smile. Julie staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The room around her started to distort once again, bending and warping like a twisted nightmare. The mirror began to crack, lines splintering across its surface like a web, and the reflection of her mother's face cracked into pieces. But the eyes, those empty eyes, remained intact, watching her with unwavering intensity. Julie's mind whirled as she stepped back, her heart pounding, but the cracks in the mirror were closing in on her. And then the figure appeared again. This time, it was behind her, its cold breath brushing against the back of her neck. "You can't run from me forever, Julie." Julie's body was paralyzed by fear, her breath shallow and ragged. The voice was too familiar now. It was the voice of the darkness, the voice of her own mind, telling her there was no escape. But there had to be something she could do. With all her strength, she forced herself to turn, facing the figure head-on. Her eyes burned with defiance, despite the terror that raked her soul. "You're not my mother," she spat, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't let you take me." The figure's smile faltered, just for a moment, before it twisted into something more grotesque. "You are mine, Julie," it hissed. "You always were." But Julie didn't back down. For the first time, she felt a spark of something more than fear, something that felt like strength. It surged through her veins, pushing away the darkness that had clung to her for so long. "I am not yours," she whispered, each word stronger than the last. And in that moment, the darkness seemed to recoil. It trembled, the figure flickering like a fading shadow. Julie reached deep within herself, grasping for the light she had once seen. Anything to shatter the terror that surrounded her. The walls trembled, and the air grew lighter, as though the very fabric of the nightmare was unraveling before her eyes. "You can't have me," she said louder now, her voice filled with power. The figure screamed, a sound of pure rage and agony. As it began to fade, its form dissipating into nothingness. And then silence. Absolute, eerie silence. Julie stood alone in the now empty room. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces at her feet. The house was still. The darkness had vanished. But Julie knew the truth. She had won. For now, she had broken free from the nightmare. And as she stepped forward into the blinding light that poured from the shattered mirror, she finally understood. The darkness would always linger, but she had the power to fight it. And no matter where it tried to hide, she would always find her way back to the light. As Julie stepped forward into the light, the air felt different now, brighter, purer. She felt a sense of weightlessness, as though the chains that had bound her for so long had been broken. The last remnants of the darkness slithered away, shrinking into the cracks from which they came. But even as she moved through the light, Julie couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't truly over. The silence that surrounded her was too perfect, too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She glanced around, her senses heightened, waiting for something, anything, to disrupt the peace. But there was nothing. No whispers. No figures. Just an endless expanse of light and clarity. Julie stood in the middle of the room, her heart finally calming. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was free. And yet, a voice lingered in the back of her mind, soft but unmistakable. "It's never over, Julie." Her breath hitched. The voice wasn't loud or commanding. It wasn't threatening. It was a whisper like a warning. Julie turned in circles, scanning the room, but saw nothing. There was only the light. Was she still trapped in some twisted version of reality? Or was this really freedom? She didn't know. But something inside her stirred. A sense of dread. A warning that this peace was fragile. And then, Just as quickly as the voice had spoken, it faded, leaving Julie with an eerie sense of emptiness. The room around her seemed to flicker, as though it were being viewed through a veil, blurring in and out of focus. Julie closed her eyes tightly, trying to steady herself. When she opened them again, she was standing in the hallway, her childhood hallway, once more. The warmth, the comfort, everything that had felt so safe just moments ago was gone. In its place stood shadows, creeping from the corners, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. Julie's body tensed. No, this couldn't be happening again. She had fought so hard, and yet, the darkness was back. The whispers returned, quiet at first, but growing louder. Julie, Julie. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a call, urgent and filled with a terrible sense of need. Julie backed away, but the shadows advanced, curling around her like tendrils, reaching for her with cold, grasping fingers. It was as if the house itself had become alive, trapping her in its grip. Julie's pulse quickened as the darkness closed in, pressing against her chest, choking her with its suffocating presence. She could hear the familiar voice again, echoing through the hall, relentless. Julie, it's not over. You belong to me. Her breath caught, and her legs gave way, collapsing beneath her as she crumpled to the floor. The shadows loomed over her, and the voice seemed to wrap around her like chains, pulling her closer to the abyss. No, 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 she cried, desperately trying to fight it, but her limbs felt heavy, useless. And then, just as the darkness seemed to consume her entirely, a spark, faint but undeniable, flared within her. A small flicker of defiance. Julie's eyes widened as she realized the truth. The darkness had never left, but she had the power to push it back. It wasn't about escaping. It was about facing it, standing tall, even in the face of it. Her heart pounded, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from strength. Julie pushed herself up, her hands shaking but determined. The shadows recoiled, as though they feared her newfound resolve. I am not yours, she whispered, her voice shaking but fierce. I will never be yours. The shadows writhed and shrieked in response, but Julie stood firm, her heart blazing with the light she had discovered inside herself. The darkness could try to haunt her. It could try to swallow her, but it would never break her. With one final, resolute breath, Julie faced the darkness head-on, and it dissolved, crumbling to dust beneath the weight of her defiance. And in its place was peace. True peace. Julie knew that she had not just escaped the nightmare. She had conquered it. Julie stood alone in the now silent hallway, the remnants of the darkness vanishing into nothingness like smoke in the wind. Her body was no longer trembling, her breath no longer ragged. The air around her felt lighter. The oppressive weight of the shadows finally lifted. The silence, once deafening, now felt soothing. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, the smell of lavender and warmth returning. She opened her eyes again, looking around. The hallway, once twisted with fear and suffocating tension, was now just a simple corridor, a reminder of everything she had fought to overcome. Her heart, once heavy with dread, now beat steadily, peacefully. Julie took a tentative step forward. She felt free. But freedom wasn't just about escaping the darkness. It was about embracing the light, even when it seemed far away. It was about accepting that the shadows would always be there, lurking in the corners, but they didn't have to control her. Julie had learned that the real battle wasn't about running away from fear. It was about standing tall in the face of it. She had fought, not just for her freedom, but for her very soul. And now, as she walked forward through the quiet hallway, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The house, once a prison, had transformed into a sanctuary, a place where she could truly heal. Julie reached the front door. It stood wide open, the sunlight streaming in from beyond, offering her the promise of a new beginning. She paused for a moment, glancing back at the house. There was no fear, no dread in her heart, just a quiet understanding that this chapter of her life was over. The door wasn't just an exit. It was a symbol of her strength. With a final glance, Julie stepped outside into the light, her heart light and her spirit whole. The darkness was gone, but she knew that the journey was just beginning. And no matter what came next, she would face it with courage. She was ready,